Okay, welcome back to POT 4936, Democracy and Propaganda. So we have reached weeks 13 and 14. We're almost to the end of the semester. We are reading Sophia Rosenfeld's book, Democracy and Truth, A Short History. As we talked about in class on Wednesday, Sophia Rosenfeld is a historian, but I pointed out she is a historian of ideas, which is a really cool thing. Historians of ideas talk about how humans have conceptualized or thought about certain ideas have changed over time. So historians of ideas are very interested in how people in the 17th century, for example, were thinking about the concept of truth and knowledge, stuff like that. So that's what we mean by when we say that Sophia Rosenfeld was a historian of ideas. What I'm going to do in this video is go over chapters 1, 2, and I think possibly 3. And then I will make a separate video for chapter 4, and that will be the video lecture for Wednesday's asynchronous class. Wednesday is the day before Thanksgiving. I said we could have an asynchronous class, which means that we don't need to meet up in the classroom, and you don't need to do any particular in-class assignment. That means, remember, Monday's ICA in-class assignment is going to be worth 12.5 points because I've squished them together into one. So for that reason, I also wanted to get this video out for you to help you over the weekend, because what you should be doing this weekend is reading very carefully chapters 1 through 3. Because the question on Monday's ICA is going to be based on those first 3 chapters of the book. And then there's only 4 chapters of the book, and it's a short book. It's a little under 200 pages, I think it is. So chapter 4 we'll save for Wednesday, and that there won't be an ICA. It will just be you need it for the second in-class essay, which will come during week 15. Oh my gosh, I know. We're going so fast. There's so much packed in here. So let's get right to it. Starting out with chapter 1, I would say chapter 1, and maybe I think there's a short introduction of a couple pages. Read that too. Don't skip over that. The introduction and chapter 1 are probably the most important chapters of the book. So if you have time to only read part of this twice, I assume you've got to have time to read all of it at least once. But if you only have time to read part of it again for a second time, reread chapter 1 after you've read, chapters 2 and 3, maybe even 4. But go back and reread chapter 1, because chapter 1 lays out her argument, and it's very nuanced. You can't rely on an internet summary of this book, you guys. I swear, I keep telling you this. Some people keep not believing me and trying to do that, and it doesn't work. So get the book, read the book, use this video, use the slides and the modules to help you zero in on what the main arguments are, so that when it comes time to do the second in-class essay, you know what the main arguments are and you can zero in on them, find a relevant quote right away, and stick it into your essay. So that's what our goal is. Get you all writing really good essays for the second in-class essay. Okay, so in this introduction, there's a couple of key points. These were highlighted in the slides on Wednesday's class, both what I said, and I think also the small group presentation highlighted this pretty well. She says that there's 2 key historical points she's going to talk about. The first point is that ideas are contextual. Ideas about truth are contextual, by which meaning, remember that word contextual means just located in a particular time and place. By located, I mean influenced by a particular time and place. So she says, questions about how best to capture reality, in other words, how to decide on what is truth, get answered differently at different junctures in history. Now remember, this is, we've been talking about this for the past 3 authors now. This does not mean that there is no such thing as objective truth. This means this is this very, I hate to use the term postmodern, but if we consider the way of thinking in the 20th and the 21st centuries, it's a pretty standard acknowledgement that some aspect of the truth is socially constructed, meaning it is not objective and neutral. And I've explained before that the aspect of truth that is the interpretation of facts once we put those facts into a narrative. But remember, as Arendt said, the facts themselves are essentially outside of the political realm. They can be neutral, except that we have to put them into a narrative, and that's when they don't become neutral. But the original fact, the fact of an event happening, that is originally an objective fact. But we can't understand an objective fact without putting it into a narrative, without giving it meaning, right? And that's when it becomes non-objective, very subjective to the particular time and place. I think I used this example, Columbus's journey across the Atlantic, right? What that fact means is different for me in the 21st century, and different for Columbus and his patrons back in the Old World, and different for the people who were already living here in the Americas when he arrived. That fact meant different things to all of those different people depending on their particular time and place, right? And it's never subjective. So she's saying the same thing here. That process by which truths are interpreted is historically contingent. That's a great phrase that comes up a lot whenever anybody is talking about this. Historically contingent is a great short way to describe that process, that idea that our interpretations of the truth is never objective or neutral. Okay, so I remember here, I think it's someplace in this chapter, chapter 1, where she talks about in the 17th century, she talks about this famous book by Stephen Chapin. I have that book. It's great. It's all about how in the 17th century, the epistemic authorities, we've seen that term used a lot too. That is who, the society looks to as, a discerner of truth. The epistemic authority was invested in the class of, gentlemen. So very aristocratic, educated gentlemen, people like Voltaire and Locke and Rousseau. It's a very narrow slice of the population, and it is a significant step, though, from having that epistemic authority invested solely in the king or the clergy, the church, right? So in the 17th century, that class of gentlemen are the ones who get invested with epistemic authority, kind of in addition to the other two. Like the authority of the king and the clergy doesn't entirely go away. It's sort of there, but it's getting challenged, for the first time in the modern period. Remember, modern period is beginning in the 16th century onward, right, in political philosophy. That's the modern period. So she talks about that in the 17th century. It's gentlemen who are invested with epistemic authority. And what she's going to describe in this chapter is how that epistemic authority gets shifted from the class of gentlemen. Sorry for the dryer, I'm doing laundry. From the class of gentlemen to the class of people who have specially trained knowledge. In other words, the experts. That's the rise of the expert class, the rise of expertise. And she explains, because she's a great historian, she explains how this comes about in the late 19th century with the need for the state to have very specialized knowledge on which to base its government, right? So her example is the U.S. Census. That's a great example of the state creating a body whose job it is to find out facts. And the specific reason they want to find out those facts is so they can govern. Okay, so you can't govern if you don't know, basic facts about your demographic and your population, right? So that's what the U.S. Census was supposed to do. And this leads to, in the late 19th century, this rise, think about before this, an educated person is very well-rounded, right? There's this idea, there's no idea of really specialized knowledge before this. This idea of very specialized knowledge arises in the late 19th century, where people, for the first time, begin to have, educated people, for the first time, begin to have areas of specialization that are so specialized that possibly another very educated person may not know that thing. You see what I mean? So it's very specialized, and this is very different from previous centuries where an educated person was very well-rounded, and there was no area of expertise, but it was like the Michelangelo, right? Michelangelo, he was great in a variety of fields, right? Late 19th century, we begin to have expertise, knowledge in specialized fields of knowledge, and this was specifically necessary for the governance of a growing nation state like the United States. Okay, so that's the first point. Sorry, I went off on that for a while. The second point, she reminds us, as she says this on page 20, truth and its opposites are always implicated in questions of power. So all that means is political power has a lot of sway in that subjective, contextual process of determining what is truth, what factual truth is, that interpretation of facts. Political power has a lot of sway in determining how we're going to interpret those facts, right? So that's kind of a no-brainer, but it's important to say, especially at the outset. Remember, this is what Arendt says at the beginning of her article as well. Doesn't it seem that political power has maybe even too much sway over determining what gets decided as true? Okay, so the overall gist here is modern democracies has, as she says, a distinctive relationship to truth. I think that quote comes from page 21, and it comes out of the transatlantic Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment, she calls it a moral crusade against unscientific knowledges. Remember, this is just basic stuff you probably all learned in high school. The Enlightenment was sort of a reaction to medieval notions of, that were very, very much steeped in religion at the time. Of course, the only religion was Catholicism in Europe, I'm talking about. And the epistemic authority was the Catholic Church. Possibly even more so than the king, because the king had to be, have the blessing of the Catholic Church. So that was the only epistemic authority during the Middle Ages. The Enlightenment is a total revolution of that idea, against that idea, of the belief in superstitions, mysticism. Remember alchemy? We could try to find a way to turn things into gold. Stuff like that. The Enlightenment is all about, no, we were rejecting all those things. We're now going to use the scientific method, that's the rise of the scientific method around this time period too, to determine how the world works. There's a term called empiricism, which I think is useful for y'all to know. This is called empiricism. Empiricism is the idea that we can gain knowledge about the world through our senses. And it's very it's kind of materialistic, but it's like, think of it, this is what is the basis for all of the natural sciences, right? Chemistry, biology, zoology, everything, physics, anything like that. Those kinds of sciences are all based on empirical knowledge, where you can test something to see whether it's true. So is it true that, like if I hold the pencil up in the air and I let go of it, it's going to fall towards the earth, and then I discover gravity, stuff like that. That is empiricism, empirical knowledge. And it has its birth in the Enlightenment era. She doesn't say this in the chapter. I'm just giving you this for background, okay? So the other thing that is very important that happens during this time is the Protestant Revolution. Now, I'm going to say this, and this doesn't mean that the Protestant religions have a greater lock on religious truth than Catholics. That's not my point here at all. That's not her point here at all. But that this is historically, it's a very important historical shift in how we think about truth and who has access to it. The reason it is that is because, of course, it's questioning the epistemic authority of the Catholic Church, right? So it becomes what she calls one of the distinctive hallmarks of modernity, because for the first time, you have this shift from questioning religious and epistemic authority to from believing that there is only one source of religious and epistemic authority to believing that there could be more than one source, right? That's a significant shift that happens during this time. And it comes along with this idea of toleration, which we get from John Locke, religious tolerance, tolerance for other interpretations of the truth, specifically religious interpretations. So what this means is that it's building the way for a questioning of the idea that there is one single epistemic authority, right? And now we have the idea that there might be more than one. We call this a plurality or pluralism, the idea that there are multiple epistemic authorities. This becomes the basis, she says, for a new political order during the 18th and 19th centuries that gives rise to republican forms of government, right? Okay, so lots of stuff. All of this is in the first chapter. You really got to read it closely. You really got to read it twice, you guys. I'm sorry, there's just no way around that. In the next slide, I'm going to talk about two ideas about truth that were fundamental to the creation of modern democracies. And this will be coming from pages 27 and 28. So if you want to pause the video here to look at those pages and have those pages ready, you can see what I'm talking about, okay? Okay, so the two ideas about truth that are fundamental to the founding of the US and all modern democracies are these. She calls it the epistemological division of labor, all right? And it's one, the idea, the belief in the wisdom of the crowd, along with two, the specialized knowledge of experts, okay? So these are the two ideas about truth that are fundamental to the founding of the US. Don't get those confused with the two historical points that she was making earlier on in the chapter. Those are important. Those 2 points were that all interpretation of knowledge and facts, all of that is contextual, sorry, I don't know, I can't pronounce that word very well, but located in particular time and place, right? And that process is always influenced by political power. Whatever the political powers that be are, they can influence that process, right? Those were the two historical points that she's making in order to make her argument. She says that's needed. But this is her actual argument, right? These are the two ideas of how people think about truth that allowed us to create modern democracies. And they come out, that first one comes out of the epistemic plurality, the idea that there's multiple sources of truth within a society and no one has a lock on the truth exclusive to everyone else, right? This idea, it's related to this idea that truth is socially constructed. And, I've sort of said for a long time, that idea of social construction is mostly a 20th century thing. But look here, she has actually traced it back, even as far back as Thomas Jefferson, with the addition of those two words to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. He could have just written, these truths are self-evident, right? But he doesn't. He writes, we hold, we, the community. That's a very subtle acknowledgement of the social construction of what is true, of what people think is true. We, this community, believes this is true. This is actually a very old idea. It goes all the way back to the sophists, Socrates. I think I talked about this when I talked about the Protagoras, the dialogue, the Protagoras. A lot of y'all were absent that day because you had done well on the previous ICA, so I said you don't need to come to class or do it on that day. But that day I talked about the Protagoras, and I gave a little more background information on the sophists. And so that idea that each city decides for itself what its ideals and morals and values are, that's a sophist idea. So it actually goes back even further. But for the most part, the understanding of some aspect of truth as being socially constructed is a very late modern idea. I used to say it's like 20th century and 21st century, but now here she's saying, you can even see traces of it as far back as the 18th century, right? Okay, so truth is a social endeavor, which means it's a collective undertaking. We don't come up with our ideas about truth in isolation from each other. It's a collective social process, right? Okay, so chapter 2, she says that modern democracy, this is where she talks about this. It's actually in chapter 2 where she's talking about this. This is on page 61. She says this idea that modern democracies are founded on two ideas, which combine both of these things that you see on this, the points that you see on this slide. Combining the idea of the role of the people with a truth regime in which a particular well-trained elite sector is primarily entrusted with defining both the how and the what of governance. I'm adding that in. The quote ends with both the how and the what. That's a quote from page 61. If you want to read that section again, that would probably be helpful. So what you have here is like both people-centered, popular knowledge, this belief in the wisdom of the crowd, which, by the way, is also, I think I've mentioned this before in class too, it's an Enlightenment idea, goes back to John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham. Those were like 19th century people who were, I think maybe actually it might have been Mill's father. It was one of the Mills. I think it might have been his father, in which case it was a little earlier, like 18th century. Anyway, this idea that people together as a whole, the crowd as a whole, they are more likely to arrive at a determination that is closer to the truth than one person thinking on their own. That's the basic idea. I summarize it as just the wisdom of the crowd, which just means that people thinking collectively as a group are more likely to arrive at the truth than somebody thinking on their own. Kind of also forms the basis for modern science too. You know, like the myth of the scientist, the mad scientist working alone in a laboratory, right? It's going to invent something. That's a myth. It's the opposite. Science, including social sciences, we work as in community with each other. Like all of our stuff, it's peer reviewed. All of our production of knowledge is a collective endeavor. I cite all these other people in my own work, putting together my own theories about propaganda and how nation states use propaganda, what political rhetoric in the 21st century is, but it's built on like all these other people's theories, right? And then other people will take my theories and they'll incorporate them and they're taken in another direction. So it's like this real like group endeavor. You know what it sounds like? Sort of sounds like the Socratic method a little bit, right? That collective building up of a truth, that collective truth discernment process, we could say, if we want to get real jargony about it, right? You all are now, after taking this class, you are now have an area of specialized knowledge about political theory, about epistemological political theory specifically. So you can use jargony terms like the truth discernment process if you want to. You might annoy some people though, so maybe hold off. Anyway, those are the two founding ideas that make modern democracies possible, right? And they have to be balanced off each other. Now, I've added here on this slide just an extra factoid for those of you who are going on to graduate school, especially if you go into international relations or more political science. You will probably hear about Fareed Zakaria's 1996 book, From Wealth to Power. Fareed Zakaria, meaning, yes, that guy who's used to, or maybe still, I can't remember if he's still on CNN. He actually was a PhD in political science, and he was a scholar for a while. He does teach. So Fareed Zakaria wrote this book in the 1990s that became really famous, very influential, and it was called From Wealth to Power, and it was all about how the United States had to build up what he called its national power, its power as a state, which means its power and effectiveness at governing itself, before it could act, internationally and become a world superpower, right? So that process of becoming a world superpower was a result of the United States building up its national power, and it did that primarily through the process that she mentions here in this book, that growth and consolidation of the administrative state, which happens from about 1890 to 1920. So just like 30 years there, right around the turn of the 20th century, where we see a lot of the rise of the statistics, information for the state, right? The consolidation, the creation of many government departments for the first time, whose job it is to go out and collect information that the government can then use to govern. All of that happens during this period, and it's the rise of what we can call the administrative state. On the other hand, what she'll talk about in chapter 2 is there's a downside to this, right? We could also say it's the rise of a bureaucracy, or the rise of a specialized class, or now the favorite term is the deep state, right? It's not some conspiracy, it's just a very pejorative way to describe people with expert knowledge, right? So now we're calling it, I guess, the deep state. There's some downsides to it. We can debate about whether that's a great term or not. I think maybe it's not a great term because it sort of sounds like it's a conspiracy theory, and of course I don't like conspiracy theories. But she does talk about this. The danger of this rise of a new bureaucratic class is that it can devolve into a sort of technocracy. It can take over, it can subvert the democratic process too much. So these 2 points on this slide, they have to be balanced against one another. They are both necessary. We can't lose one of them and still expect to be able to have a modern democracy. We will not be a democracy anymore if we just have, the wisdom of the crowd that's like a populist demagogue, that's why it paves the way. When we lose that, what we've seen in recent years is the questioning of all expert knowledge, and that is paving the way for the rise of populist demagogues all over the world, not just in our country. And that's not going to lead to more democracy. That's going to lead to strongman rule, right? Authoritarianism. And then if we get rid of the wisdom of the crowd, the belief in the necessity for popular knowledge, and we just have rule by experts, that's a technocracy, that's an oligarchy, and that also is undemocratic. So we really need both of these 2 points working together in order to have modern democracies. This is what's so important about her book, and this is like the main point I want you to be able to grasp as you're reading this book. And when you go back and reread it a second time after watching this video, underline the points, some good quotes that you could then use in your when you write the second in-class essay, which will be in like 2 weeks. Okay, so I hope this video was helpful. I will make another one for Wednesday's class, okay? I'll see you all on Monday. Be ready to write about Sophia Rosenfeld's book, chapters 1 through 3.